Hello, happy Mushroom Day, everybody. Hope you're having a great day with the content so far. Well, my name is Jonathan Carmichael, and I'm the president of Entheogenesis Australis, and I'm going to be here interviewing Martin Williams from Prism. So, Martin, welcome.
It's good to be here. Thank you.
All right, let's jump straight into it. So, just got a few questions for you today. Let's start with the following. Okay, Martin, what can you tell us about Prism and why the organisation was founded and what its main purpose is?
Okay, so Prism was founded in 2011. It came about as a consequence of the presenters forum, which followed the EGA Melbourne symposium at the end of 2010. And one of our international guests was Dr. Rick Doblin from MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies in the US. And he was telling us about the research using MDMA-assisted therapy for the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder that they had been studying through clinical trials in the US over the previous sort of few years at that stage. And so the purpose of the forum was really to try and decide among the Australian cohort whether we might have the interest, the skills, the resources to try and make an Australian contribution to the global psychedelic medical research area. The outcome of that forum was that yes, we felt that we could, and in fact, Rick Doblin pledged MAPS financial support for us to establish an organisation and hopefully to get a clinical trial up and running in Australia. In fact, we put a fair bit of effort in that following year, 2011, into developing a protocol with MAPS's assistance, and we put that to an ethics committee for approval in the beginning of 2012. We were quite quickly knocked back, unfortunately, and in fact, it took us another 6 or 7 years until we finally got a psychedelic research trial underway in Australia. But the main purpose of Prism is really to support, to coordinate and to communicate the results of psychedelic medical research in Australia, and thereby see if we can make that Australian contribution to the global research effort, studying what, interestingly enough, regarded as novel therapies for the treatment of mental health conditions such as anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and so on.
Okay, next question. Martin, do you mind telling us what the psychedelic research climate is like in Australia and how it has developed in the time Prism has been operating?
Yeah, so in fact, I'd say there was essentially no psychedelic research climate in Australia whatsoever when we established Prism, and it quickly became apparent to us that we were somewhat ahead of the game in Australia. At that stage, of course, psychedelics had a significant social stigma. They were academically or research speaking a rather sort of hot potato or don't go there sort of topic. It was considered to be career suicide, I guess, for researchers to express any interest in studying psychedelics, either from a fairly fundamental point of view or from a therapeutic applications point of view. And so really that sort of that conservatism, academic conservatism, took quite a number of years to start to drop away. I guess we at Prism could probably take some credit for having led the conversation in Australia, although it was really at a pretty low level for quite some time. It was really only about 2015 or 2016 that the conversation really started to move forward in Australia. And that was as more of the research clinical trial results were becoming known around the world and from other countries such as the USA, from the UK, Switzerland, Canada, and Israel. And then, of course, there was a groundswell of interest which really developed following a couple of key articles in the book, How to Change Your Mind, The New Science of Psychedelics by Michael Pollan. And that really, I think, was the turning point for psychedelics globally. And Australia really didn't take too long to catch on there. Meanwhile, of course, Prism was contributing to that conversation. We were having some excellent media exposure, and we had had two tilts by that stage at establishing a clinical trial of MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD, both unsuccessful, of course, but the real, I think, the key moment in Australia was when we brought together again a number of researchers and a lot of interested people for the EGA event, outdoor conference symposium in 2017, December 2017. And that was when we realised we were really starting to gain critical mass, and enough people were there together who had a research interest and who were frustrated by the current state of play in mental health research and treatment in Australia, that we really started to see an opportunity to bring things forward. So yeah, from a very low base, we've come a long way in 10 years. It hasn't happened overnight, of course, and it hasn't happened just on its own. I think we've contributed to that very substantially. And I think we need to acknowledge the contribution of the Australian psychedelic community in continuing that conversation and being as open as they have to moving things forward.
Do you mind telling us what role Prism played in getting the St Vincents psilocybin end-of-life trial established?
So the St Vincents trial really came about through a meeting between Margaret Ross, Dr. Marg Ross of St Vincents Hospital, Melbourne, and myself, and that was immediately following the 2017 EGA conference in near Eildon in Victoria. Marg Ross is a palliative care and psycho-oncology specialist clinical psychologist who deals on a daily basis with people experiencing distress, fear, depression and anxiety associated with terminal illness. And she had been frustrated by the lack of efficacy of the resources that were available to her. She had become aware of some of the research taking place in the US, particularly at Johns Hopkins University and at New York University. Those results of their clinical trials had just been published they'd been published in the end of 2016. And both of those clinical trials, phase 2 trials, established really excellent and very promising results. In other words, there was a significant relief from distress associated with terminal cancer that was demonstrated in both of those phase 2 trials. And so Marg contacted me just after the EGA in 2017. We met at the beginning, in the first couple of days of January in 2018, and very quickly worked together on writing a protocol. Of course, Marg wrote the major share of that protocol, and we worked together on getting that trial through the various ethics committee approvals, hospital approvals, and then Victorian, state and federal approvals. So that process took the better part of 2 years, basically, between hatching that original plan and actually recruiting the first participant. But it was a steady and positive process all the way along.
Okay, thanks, Martin. Our next question. In an Australian context, what is so special about the St Vincent's psilocybin end-of-life trial?
Well, the St Vincent's end-of-life trial is special in that it is actually the first clinical trial of psychedelics or psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy in Australia to have taken place, as far as we know, at any time in the past. And so it is groundbreaking because it established that there is the potential to study psychedelic therapies in Australia in a public hospital context, admittedly at this stage with philanthropic funding, but I think it has really paved the way for a dramatic increase in interest and commitment from the Australian medical research community to investigating these alternative approaches to mental health treatment. The St Vincent's trial itself incorporates a couple of, novel approaches compared with the trials that are completed and ongoing in other parts of the world. One is that we are extending the treatment beyond cancer, terminal cancer, to other terminal conditions, which we call non-malignant conditions. and those would be conditions such as chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, heart failure, a number of conditions that are no less debilitating to people in terms of their mental health and their fear of dying, essentially, but they haven't been addressed explicitly in any other trials around the world. We've also been exploring some novelties in terms of provision of music, which is very much a part of the psilocybin-assisted therapy protocol globally, and we're very interested in finding ways to increase the flexibility of the music choice for the participants during their psilocybin active drug experience.
Okay, thanks, Martin. Next question. What are some of the advantages or unique properties of working with psilocybin in a therapeutic context?
So psilocybin, of course, is what we call a classical psychedelic. So it's one of the serotonergic compounds, which means that psilocybin, along with other psychedelics such as mescaline, LSD, 2CB, a number of the other classical psychedelics, all act at the serotonin 5-HT2A and 2C receptors in the brain and certain parts of the brain. Psilocybin is not exactly unique, but it has the particular advantage of eliciting an experience that is relatively rapid in onset, and then it proceeds for usually about 4 to 6 hours, during which time there's a tail off of the experience, both in terms of visual experience as well as the internal mental processes. Psilocybin, of course, being a natural compound that is produced in mushrooms, certain species of mushrooms, and as a natural product is essentially non-toxic, so it's very safe to work with. Nonetheless, it's still a very powerful therapeutic tool because it seems to bring about a number of changes in thought processes and patterns. There's still a lot of work being done to establish just what is actually happening in the mind and in the brain. But what it does seem to do, of course, is elicit access to deep memories and bring memories back into I guess a combination with current experience, and also provide an alternative perspective on somebody's current experience. And so one of the common features, it seems, of the kinds of mental health conditions or mental illnesses that can be addressed by psilocybin-assisted therapy are problems such as depression and anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder, eating disorders. These disorders all seem to revolve around what we'd call rumination, or that overwhelming sense of self-narrative, or I guess a focus on what's going on in one's own life. And so psilocybin seems to shake things up or reset things to a certain degree, so that some of those rather rigid thought patterns can be disrupted and can be reset afresh. Now, at the neurological level, it does appear that psilocybin and the other classical psychedelics promote the reconnection among neuronal pathways in the brain, and so they can re-establish some of the networks which appear to have deteriorated or diminished through these particular mood disorders or affective disorders. And so in quietening down certain networks in the brain and allowing greater what we call functional connectivity among lapsed parts of the brain, it appears that a lot of those sort of rumination issues can be addressed. So psilocybin, as I said, is very safe. It seems to be very effective. It can give quite a strong experience very reliably. And in the studies that have been done, particularly at Johns Hopkins University in the US, they seem to have established a strong positive correlation between the intensity of the mystical or spiritual experience and the therapeutic outcomes. So there are lots of strands to tie together there. I hope I've managed to pull those together in a reasonably comprehensible way. But as I say, we're still sort of really trying to get to the bottom of what's happening during a classical psychedelic and particularly psilocybin experience.
Next question. In a nutshell, what do you feel are some of the most interesting clinical outcomes globally from working with psilocybin in a research or therapeutic setting?
Probably one of the most interesting clinical outcomes is that the benefits, the therapeutic benefits, come from just one or two doses or experiences with psilocybin in either a research or a therapeutic setting. So it seems that the psilocybin occasioned experience is really very powerful in resetting somebody's sort of pathway. And so I think really that's most people would agree that is a real game changer in terms of mental health treatment. By comparison, of course, most pharmaceutical treatments, what we call pharmacotherapies for these kind of mood disorders, such as depression, anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder, and so on, usually involve the administration of for example, a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor or one of the other antidepressants pretty much every day for an indeterminate period of time. So the dramatic improvement in people's condition seems to be almost unique to the psychedelics. We can probably include ketamine as in that class of psychedelics in this particular therapeutic application. But in any case, just the very small number of treatments seems to be a notable feature. Another thing, of course, is that we have yet to really determine whether it's the psilocybin itself or it's the psilocybin as an adjunct to psychotherapy, which is really doing the work. In general, it's been accepted that psilocybin needs to be used in combination with psychotherapy, so that psilocybin just taken on its own won't necessarily bestow the therapeutic benefits that the therapeutic intervention really achieves. But at this stage, as I say, the jury's a little bit out. But most of the research being done so far and the therapy protocols, both in research and the clinical setting that may come from out of this research, all include a psychotherapeutic or talk therapy component.
Okay, thanks, Martin. Next question. Thinking of patient outcomes broadly, what are the main differences between psilocybin and, say, traditional antidepressants such as SSRIs?
Well, it certainly does appear that there are very different modes of action between psilocybin and the classical psychedelics versus the traditional selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, or SNRIs, serotonin noradrenaline reuptake inhibitor. I think this stems from maybe slightly differing models of how depression in particular, but of course these other angles or manifestations of that mental illness comes about. And of course the serotonin reuptake inhibitors are intended to address a perceived deficiency in serotonin, which may just in general result in a low affect or a low mood, which is ongoing. And so SSRIs are known for taking quite a long time to be effective for people who are experiencing depression. And they also have some significant issues in that they are then quite difficult to taper off without precipitating some much further, more severe depressive episodes. As I said before, the SSRIs and other antidepressants are generally intended to be administered or taken regularly for an indeterminate period of time. And people who have the many people who have taken SSRI and other antidepressants, including the older wave of tricyclic antidepressants and so on, all say that let's see, the amplitude of their emotions or their emotional sort of range is somewhat diminished. Now, this can be very helpful for people who are experiencing very low periods, but on the other hand, a lot of people seem to be critical that they also start to lack the capacity for great joy and for great positive moods, which nonetheless people experiencing depression can sometimes experience in any case. The other thing, of course, is that SSRIs and other antidepressants do have a number of other side effects, including weight gain, loss of sexual function or libido, quite a number of other concerning side effects. Psilocybin and the classical psychedelics, because they actually act at the serotonin receptors themselves and don't really modulate the level of serotonin in the system in any way, seem to act by a very different mechanism. And those pathways, as I mentioned before, appear to be more related to the re-establishment of neuronal connections, not the regrowth of neurons, it has to be said, but the re-establishment of connections among the existing neurons, which seems to improve the mood and reduce anxiety and help to break people out of rigid thought patterns. So really there's very little comparison between the mechanisms of action of psilocybin or classical psychedelics and the traditional antidepressants.
Thanks, Martin. Do you mind telling us a little bit about the difference between how psilocybin's used in a therapeutic setting to, say, how SSRIs are currently being used, which I believe in some cases with SSRIs there really is no end game?
That's exactly right. So yes, that is a feature, as I mentioned earlier, about psilocybin and other classical psychedelics, is that they seem to provide the therapeutic benefit after only 1, 2, maybe 3 administrations. Now, that's not to say that the therapeutic outcomes will last forever. And in fact, in some ways, people liken psychedelic therapies to perhaps bringing a car in for a tune-up and then maybe having to bring it back for service from time to time. It's really hard to say because it's very early days at this stage, and just how long-lasting those effects are. But the research to date does suggest that the benefits can remain with a participant or a patient for weeks, months, even years before there might be any kind of relapse. Of course, we need to take into account the environment that people are living in. Some people, unfortunately, are just living in a life that does present a number of challenges which may be difficult to overcome and which might have an ongoing effect on somebody's mood. So in many cases, it's also a matter of trying to improve somebody's living conditions so that they can move beyond the source of their mental health condition, their anxiety, depression, or whatever. And so this is where psilocybin with psychotherapeutic or talk therapeutic support really seems to be so effective. So, of course, there are the 3 stages that we talk about in psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. The first is a preparatory stage during which a patient or a participant is prepared by the therapists for the experience ahead, particularly if they haven't had any psychedelic experiences prior. Then it's very important to give them a sense of what they might come across and how they would be able best to face their experience. The second step, of course, is the active drug session or sessions themselves. And after each of those drug sessions, which usually would be in the company of 1 or 2 therapists, usually 2 therapists, for essentially a whole day of therapy, so that's usually an 8-hour period, then the very important step after that, of course, is the integrative stage. And that's when the patient or participant is encouraged to discuss and make sense of their experience, and hopefully put that experience into context of their own lives and their own situation. And so that's when really the great benefits come about, because once people are able to put their own situation into context, then that seems to be a source of that sort of, or the starting point for the benefits to come.
Thanks, Martin. Okay, next question. To my knowledge, state-funded psychedelic research options are unheard of. What can you tell us about the recent government announcement of $15 million to fund psychedelic medical research in Australia, and how do you interpret this surprising bold move?
I certainly agree that it's a surprising and a bold move by the federal government to announce $15 million of research funding through what's called the Medical Research Future Fund. The MRFF is the federal government's vehicle for supporting a very broad range of medical research in Australia, but along certain key category lines. And so the particular category for which this $15 million is pitched is novel mental health therapies. I guess we're at a very particular point in history that has led to the government's announcement. One, of course, is that the coronavirus pandemic has really exacerbated mental health problems in Australia and, of course, many other parts of the world. And so there is a perceived greater need for exploration of novel therapies when so many of the current therapies appear not to be particularly effective. Now, it's very interesting from our point of view to see this $15 million government pledge, because this effectively would make Australia one of the very first countries in the world for public sector funding of psychedelic research for therapeutic purposes to take place. Now, certainly we've seen plenty of funding, particularly in the USA, but also in Australia for a number of years, exploring the harms of psychedelics and other scheduled drugs. But in this particular instance, we're seeing a complete turnaround, and we're very heartened by that. We're very pleased. We're very hopeful that the funding process will take place in a transparent, open, and positive sort of manner. We still have some skepticism, I have to say, about whether that is actually going to take place. But what I can say is that it has very much excited the research field. Of course, as soon as any significant amount of money is announced through public sector funding, then researchers tend to sit up and take notice, because research funding is chronically tight in Australia and other parts of the world. So far, the psychedelic research taking place in Australia is to be funded entirely through philanthropic and in fact some crowdsourcing approaches as well. But this is going to be a big shot in the arm, and I think it really represents a big step forward. We can also say that there's potential for private sector funding of psychedelic research, and that is taking place, as far as I know, already in Australia through one of the Monash University planned trials of psilocybin for generalised anxiety disorder. That's also going to be very interesting to see how that all plays out. So it's a very dynamic situation we find ourselves in, rather surprisingly, given that even as recently as 4 years ago, we had no concept that any of this was going to take place at all. We didn't even know that there was going to be any Australian psychedelic research at all, let alone the promise of government funding for that research.
Fantastic. So very good news.
But I guess one more thing I can say, however, is that it is particularly interesting because by the time a lot of this government-funded research in Australia is complete, let alone started. Quite a number of the phase 3 clinical trials globally into psilocybin-assisted therapies as well as MDMA-assisted therapies may well be complete. And in fact, these drugs may have been approved for clinical use by the FDA and the European Medicines Agency. So it's going to be interesting to see, because this basically represents ongoing therapeutic or clinical research in Australia, which we feel very positive about, because it's going to enable us to explore some of the other mental health conditions which haven't yet been studied in relation to psilocybin or other psychedelics. And so we feel this is a really golden opportunity for Australia for our researchers to put Australia on the global research map. So yeah, we're very pleased about that.
So I know Prism have very much supported reform in this space for research purposes and general access, but not all reform is the best way forward. What were your criticisms of the recent application to the TGA for rescheduling of psilocybin? If you could give us a bit of a context.
Sure. So there were applications made to the Therapeutic Goods Administration in Australia at the beginning of, in July of 2020, to reschedule both psilocybin and MDMA from Schedule 9 in Australia, which is prohibited substances, back to Schedule 8, which is controlled medicines. And the key point of difference there is that in Schedule 9, compounds are explicitly permitted to be used for research, but not for clinical practice, whereas in Schedule 8, compounds which are then redefined essentially as medicines can be administered or prescribed by qualified prescribers, usually specialist doctors, medical practitioners, for use in clinical treatment. Now, I think that really underlines the difference between psilocybin as an unregistered but potential medicine, and psilocybin as a registered medicine, which then subsequently, after rescheduling, would be placed after a process of application and significant research and follow-up onto what's called the Australian Register for Therapeutic Goods. I have to stress that Prism is in favour ultimately of rescheduling of psilocybin, and of course Prism is fundamentally in favour of decriminalisation of psilocybin and other drugs, although that's a very different conversation, of course. But psilocybin should be rescheduled and approved as a medicine in Australia, but only after the clinical trials are complete globally and hopefully in Australia as well, because establishing efficacy in Australia is still an important part of the global process. And then, only then, we feel it would be appropriate to approve those as medicines. Now, there are certain approaches that may be adopted. There is what's called a compassionate use scheme, and we know that people are exploring those options in Australia, and that may be the way to go. In the meantime, we'll just have to wait and see. Now, understandably, there's some frustration because the higher schedule of psilocybin, Schedule 9 in Australia, does preclude or prevent the use of psilocybin through that compassionate use scheme in certain states, but not all states in Australia, it has to be said. So it's a rather complicated situation. It's not ideal, but to our mind, there's a process that needs to be completed before rescheduling and approval can take place.
Next question. Psilocybin mushrooms are available for adults to collect every mushroom season, be it lawful or not. If you were asked to recommend just one drug law reform to help reduce suffering, what would you propose and why?
I guess I can really only speak from my own perspective and not necessarily representing Prism. I certainly can't speak for the other members of Prism in this area, but of course I feel that decriminalisation is the first step in eliminating the collateral harms associated with these drug laws. I think most of us agree that psilocybin and mushrooms should never have been placed in the schedules in the first place, but it is a situation that we find ourselves in this particular moment. I would encourage, however, a real sort of community process of education, so that the initial steps that I think we've been able to take in opening up psilocybin and other drugs to the conversation at the legal and legislative levels can be sustained, is to ensure that there is effective education within the community and of new members coming into the community, and that just includes the whole community, the whole society in Australia. It's been fantastic to see the online forums, which have been, and the various groups which have been focused on educating people, assisting with identification, and thereby minimising potential harm, which otherwise could be regarded as a reason for maintaining some sort of regulation or control over mushroom harvesting. But I think once we have, on the one hand, a legislative process to approve psilocybin and other psychedelics potentially as medicines, thereby recognising that they are safe, non-toxic, and in fact may eventually be recognised as improving the lives of otherwise mentally well people, let alone people experiencing mental illness, then if we have that in tandem with a self-education, self-regulation process, I think that's really going to be together the greatest step, along with decriminalisation, to reduce the negative impacts of the drug laws as they stand at the moment.
Thanks, Martin. Yeah, it's a really interesting area, because when it comes to magic mushrooms, it's really the community driving the best education on the subject. A lot of the major ID guides don't really want to cover magic mushrooms. It's really like groups like My Community, Facebook groups, EGA, the APS, and Shaman Australis, community projects like that really are the best resource for this area. Have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, look, I think it's clear that there's a huge body of knowledge within the community, within the myco community and beyond, and so that, of course, that knowledge and wisdom should be nurtured. It should be encouraged, and it should be spread more broadly. So, yeah, I think unfortunately to date, so much of the official position has been directed towards maintaining the status quo, and it simply is insulting to the community to have its knowledge and wisdom just completely discredited or discounted in such a way.
Thanks, Martin. Okay, the next question is, there have been a lot of advocacy groups operating for decades around ethnobotany and psychedelic access in Australia, including the Nimbin Hemp Embassy, EGA, Prism, more recently the APS. What role do you feel these organisations have played in the recent interest in this area?
Well, I think really the role of, for example, the Hemp Embassy, EGA, the Australian Psychedelic Society, and so on, has really been to keep the flame alive, and gradually to spread the word, and increase awareness in the broader community. Now, things are happening rather faster now, and I guess you could see that as a bit of a snowball effect. Of course, there have been some external factors or influences, including the global awareness surrounding psychedelics through books and media articles and a generally broad treatment. But yeah, I think that the organisations have an ongoing role to play, because they're focused on promulgating or spreading accurate information knowledge and providing a well-focused sort of hub for communication within the community. Of course, Prism has the focus of research in medicine in particular. EGA has the mission to broaden an awareness of entheogens and generally naturally occurring plant and other psychoactive compounds. And of course, the Nimbin Hemp Embassy has a well stated brief to bring about and to promote cannabis law reform, and of course the application of cannabis products to health conditions as well. So yeah, look, I think we've all got our part to play, and that's just very much a part of the community as it's been, and hopefully it's going to be an ongoing part of the community.
And how can people get in contact with Prism or donate if they want to support?
Prism has a website, of course, prism.org.au, so very easy to find us.
Thanks, Martin. Okay, we'll finish it there, I think. Just a reminder, Martin Williams and many other great psychedelic minds from Australia will be joining us all in December at Entheogenesis Australis 2021. So tickets are just gone back on sale. So yeah, have a look at the website and we'll see you at the end of the year for the National Gathering of Psychedelic Minds. Thanks and have a great afternoon.